Welcome to the Sisters in Crime Writers Podcast. Everyone has a unique writing journey, so join us for conversations about those journeys from the writers themselves. Hi, this is Julie Henriques, the Executive Director of Sisters in Crime, and I am really delighted to welcome Mariah Fredericks to the podcast this week. Mariah was born, raised, and still lives in New York City. She graduated from Vassar College with a degree in history. She's the author of the Jane Prescott Mystery Series, which has twice been nominated for the Mary Higgins Clark Award. The Lindbergh Nanny, her first standalone novel, was nominated for the Agatha and Anthony Awards. The Wharton Plot was named one of Library Journal's best crime novels of the year. Her new novel, The Girl in the Green Dress, featuring New Yorker writer Morris Markey and Zelda Fitzgerald, was published on September 2nd. Mariah, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much, Julie.
Well, I am delighted to have this conversation, and I'm going to start it where I always start them. When did you say to yourself, I want to write a novel?
Frighteningly early on, like pretentiously early on. My parents had a lot of books, and the one that I didn't understand was Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, that they were obsessed with. And I remember I read it like the first page, and I decided I'm going to write a spy novel. I think I was 7 years old. And I sat down and I typed out all of a line and a half of of that spy novel, and that's as far as that went. But I really loved the book, Richard Scarry's What Do People Do All Day, where you're sort of looking into windows and talking about what people do all day.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I want to do, is look into windows and talk about what people do and why.
So we're going to talk about those windows that you look into, because you write historical fiction, which is a different way of looking through windows. But let's just talk about the craft of writing. You know, how did you build the craft once and when did you really say, okay, we're gonna do this?
We're going to do this. We're going to put our words out there. I think a big shift for me. I was born with a slight speech defect. So that doesn't make your elementary school years all that easy. Yeah. And I remember there was a teacher, and I was in 6th or 7th grade, English teacher, and he said, I like your writing. I think you should try writing something for the school newspaper. And of course, if a teacher invites you to do that, you do that. And I think I wrote some goofy thing about the theater, and he printed it. And all of a sudden, what I said could be understood without me having to speak. And people responded a lot better to that. And I went to a very small school, so it was low stakes in some ways. But I think that those articles, which I started writing every month, were my first experience of putting words and stories out there and having people respond positively to them. And then, so, I thought, I'll go to college and I'll write a novel while I'm in college, and it will obviously get published once I graduate. This was sort of like the era of Jane McInerney and Bret Easton Ellis. Right. You were supposed to be young and badly behaved to be a novelist. And of course that didn't happen. But that was my plan. So I kept going for about, I think, like 3 or 4 novels just went nowhere. And then finally, I was trying to write a Jane McInerney novel, and then finally my husband, who worked in children's publishing, said, why don't you try for younger readers? So I sat down and I wrote about this hideously embarrassing experience I'd had in ninth grade. And that became the true meaning of cleavage. The second editor we showed it to took it. So I was like, oh, make change. If it's not working, change it up is always my big piece of advice to people.
And so talk to me though about building that craft. So it's not writing for young audience is not easy. There's so many misconceptions about what it takes to write a book. Writing a cozy isn't easy. Writing a young adult or middle grade book is not an easy thing. So how did you develop the craft
of writing a young adult book
or writing books in general?
I think I wrote short, funny articles. And as you know, like when you are being funny, that's a real tightrope. Like you really have to be disciplined. You have to develop a real ear for what the beats are. So I think in a weird way, being funny and writing short was excellent training for writing a novel. I read a lot and I went to a lot of theater. So I learned how to listen to voice and how to convey information in a dramatic way using voice and using like the power of confession. I think up until the Wharton Plot, all my books were first person because I really like that relationship. With YA, which you're right, is a really hard. People think it's simple because what kind of vocabulary do those kids have? It's easy, and you just, to some degree, pick something you have a feel for. Not everybody can write cozy. You have to have a real feel for that voice and that world and that rhythm. And YA, I was fortunate that it came kind of naturally to me. I'm just essentially immature. So,
and tell me about the pivot to mystery.
Pivot to mystery. Actually, MWA. I have to give MWA credit for this. I had just had my first, my only child, and I got an email saying your novel Crunch Time has been nominated for an Edgar. I didn't even know what an Edgar was, and the novel Crunch Time was my story of when I was taking the SATs. One kid in our class cheated, so I wrote a novel featuring 4 different voices of kids taking the SATs, and you have to figure out which one of them has cheated. I didn't know I was writing a mystery. But as they informed me, it's very hard to find candidates and nominees for the YA category. So I was like, oh, okay, that's flattering. And I went to the Edgars, and I was so struck by the mood in that room of the mystery community, because at that time YA had gotten a little fraught and ungenerous, and people were so kind and enthusiastic for one another's work and supportive and excited. And I thought, oh, wow, these are absolutely the people that I want to be with. And I realized with a mystery, it's inherently high stakes, that I was very drawn to a story of, I like looking at why people do terrible things to one another. And a mystery is just sort of a logical outcome of that interest. And of course, you get to identify the perpetrator and you get to hold them accountable. So that's very, very satisfying, unlike YA, where people are not always held accountable.
Yeah, I will say, we talk about this on this podcast and in other places. The crime writing community is a very wonderful community. I mean, it's truly supportive. I would argue perhaps it's because people are working out all their issues on the page, but and of course there are some who aren't, but for the most part, it's an incredibly supportive community.
I agree. And I think part of that is the genre aspect. Most of the people I know who write mystery have done something else in their lives. They've been journalists or lawyers or teachers, and I think it gives people, I don't know, a sort of a grounded quality that lets you be just more humble and more, and just more aware that you get what you give. If you I went through my YA career very guarded and protective, and I isolated. I didn't want to be phony in any way, and network or be social. And so when I switched to adult mystery, I thought I'm going to go about this in a totally different, like far less ego-driven, paranoid way, and it's better, amazingly.
Well, it is better. But also, when you build a community and the readers are so amazing in this community as well, it propels you. But let's now talk about writing historical. Now, was this something that always you were a history major at Vassar? So that probably helped develop some critical skills and some researching skills. But were you what drove you towards historical?
So I always loved historical fiction, and I loved, particularly if it had a very high death toll. I loved, Josephine Tey's Daughter in Time. But I never thought I could write historical fiction because I thought it required visual world building skills that I did not have. I saw my primary gift as voice, and sort of a present tense voice, the YA voice. And then I was at work on a YA novel, and it sounds very woo-woo, but the first two lines of what became A Death of No Importance came to me, which were, I will tell it, and I will tell it badly. And I was intrigued by the idea. I thought, well, what are you talking about? Well, obviously, the voice seemed to have been sitting on this story for a while. So it was a secret. What do you keep a secret? A crime. Why hadn't she spoken before? Well, maybe nobody would listen to her. Why wouldn't you listen to her? Well, maybe she didn't have a lot of status. Nobody took her seriously. Maybe she should be a servant. So it had to be a historical mystery, and I wanted it to be a historical mystery. So I thought, you're going to have to figure out how to do something that you are 98% sure you can't do. And what I learned was, I'm not Caleb Carr, who's going to, tell you exactly how that doorknob is fashioned and,
right.
details I cannot produce even now. But what I learned is that voice can help you. If you can capture the voice of that feels right to people for that era, you've gone a long way. I say, I'm not good at describing physical things and scenes, but Jane Prescott, the heroine of that book, is. So as long as I'm Jane Prescott, I'm fine. Another thing that helped me enormously was working for Book of the Month Club for many years as a copywriter, where you wrote these articles about books where you would pick out 3 to 5 really cool things about a work of history that people wouldn't know that would be intriguing. So when I look at a particular event or an era, I have a good eye because I've been trained to, find that fun headline or that weird fact you didn't know about Teddy Roosevelt and his habits or whatever. So that was also very good training.
So when, I find it interesting and understandable because you're a writer, but talk to me about the, Mariah has trouble with this, but Jane Prescott doesn't, about that immersing yourself in the period. And so the Jane Prescotts are in the early 1900s.
Yeah, 1910s. Yeah.
Did you read newspapers? How did you build the muscle that could let you have her voice?
Yes, newspapers are huge because newspapers are so much fun at this era. In this era, there are no rules. They're bawdy, they're raucous, they're true some of the time. You really get a sense of a young country, and particularly New York, really finding its voice. So that was really attractive to me, and that definitely helped. Also, I was reading a lot of Edith Wharton and her letters. Not that Edith Wharton is a lady's maid, but just to give a sense of what a woman's voice who's highly intelligent and wants to be witty and engaging sounds like. There are just certain little ticks that people fall into. I can't think of one right now, but so that was one way that I did it. And Wharton has a very sly voice, the way that she doesn't directly call people out, but it's just sort of like a little fillip at the end of a paragraph. So that I used for Jane.
Well, and I love the idea of reading letters, because again, newspapers, a huge part of just immersive, and reading a whole newspaper lets you see the ads and the little tiny articles and the other things that are just like, oh, this is what it was like. This is what people ate or thought about her. But reading letters is such a wonderful way of understanding how somebody conversed and what was important and how they wanted to tell the story, because of course they're using their own voice, which is reflected in writing.
Right. But it's interesting. It's often sort of a heightened voice. Yes. I find, they are determined to entertain. Letters, I guess, were the big entertainment of the time. So often if people can, they deliver in their descriptions. It's much more than, hey, how you doing? We're doing fine. They really do a whole song and dance.
When people get upset about not writing letters anymore, part of me is like, well, emails and it's different forms of communications. But the other part of me thinks about the insights we got from people's letters and their perceptions, and they're sort of letting my guard down, but telling somebody I care about what happened today. It's such an amazing gift to readers, and we're not going to have that in the future.
No, unless I put some energy into my email, but of course I don't want them all saved. So
it's always good to put energy, and I think that's your thought about Wharton being, it's heightened. It is heightened, and it's so important. So when I talk to people, sometimes they get stuck in a period, not stuck, but that's what they want. You talk to Kitty Noden, it's Victorian. I can't imagine her ever writing outside of Victorian England. She has a PhD. I don't blame her, use it all. But you go between the teens and the 20s of, and while that may only seem like a decade, it's such a huge time, World War I and fashion. There's such a huge time of change. So, tell me about that and your curiosity and what drove you to that.
Well, again, this is where failure worked for me, because after 4 books, Minotaur said, "We love Jane, and that's enough, Jane," which was very painful and a big shock, as it always is for us when series comes to an end. And they said, "We want a historical standalone," which is another. I was just like, you what? Like, because to me, like, historical mysteries work. My concept of them was you come up with a really good point of view and a perspective that people haven't seen before, and then you immerse people in an era that they love. And they keep coming back because you develop these characters that they want to follow. So I was like, oh, standalone, I'm going to have it do that. So I was thinking famous crimes that I would tell the ladies' maid point of view of a famous crime. And I was proposing all these things to my agent. She was sort of like, And then I remember where I was standing in my house where I remembered Murder on the Orient Express, which starts with servants, as the kidnapper enters the house. And I remember the nanny who was on the ground struggling as the baby is taken. And I thought, oh my God, wait, did the Lindbergh baby really have a nanny? And I looked it up, and he did. And she was young and attractive, which I wish didn't matter to the story, but it does when selling a book. And I called my agent at like 9 a.m. in the morning. And I said, okay, it's the Lindbergh kidnapping from the nanny's point of view. And she said, do I have to propose anything else to your editor? And I said, nope, that's it. That's the idea. So that's how I got into the 1930s, which, of course, after the 1910s, which is up until the war, a joyous, ebullient, we're making so much progress. Women are moving into the public sphere. People of color are moving into the public sphere. It's really dynamic. And then you go post-depression, when no one thinks democracy is working and capitalism is not working. And I'll tell you, it was a bummer of a headspace to be in.
Yeah.
But the story was so strong that I had that consolation that it was not an era I enjoyed being in. It was a very painful story to tell, but Betty Gow's story was so amazing that at least I could feel I was getting back down on paper.
So you're parallel to Murder on the Orient Express and the fact that Christie did take that in the headlines story. So that must have also hit her as she was searching for what this next book is. It's like this terrible, I think she wrote it at the same time the trial was going on. I mean, it's before
they arrested Halpern, which is interesting. So that's why it's a gangster in the story, not to ruin it for people, but yeah.
Well, it's, but it's also I don't know that everyone knows about the Lindbergh kidnapping. So, that's also part of what you're doing is you're bringing back these characters from history who were real and, Charles Lindbergh was complicated, which you don't realize, until you start reading more. And Anne Morrow Lindbergh was an amazing writer and did things. But this fact that this baby was kidnapped is just a horrifying story.
Yeah. A lot of I've done presentations on the book, and people would raise their hand. They'd say, well, when did they find the baby? When did he come back? And I'd be like, oh no, he didn't. And they're just stunned. With that happening to somebody so famous and so wealthy.
That's right. I mean, and so it's fiction, but based in facts of this real life person's point of view. How is that? Was it, did you feel obligated to make sure it was accurate 1,000,000%, or did you say just use her as an inspiration? How was that in the writing?
Because the Lindbergh kidnapping is so famous, I felt, and because I was putting forth a theory about how the crime happened, that was one where I felt I had to be rigorously true to the known facts. And I was very lucky in Betty Gow in that she gave me just enough of her personality in interviews and police reports and the facts of her life that it all served the story. There were a few glitches in her life that I had to figure out how to handle. But overall, she was sort of the perfect heroine. Now, Lindbergh, as a character, this was the first time I had ever written about real people. And starting with Charles Lindbergh was not something I'd recommend. I was up until 2 a.m. in the morning figuring out how, to me, he was the father of a murdered child, which demands some deference on the part of the writer. On the other hand, you can't ignore his history and his personality and what he did and said. And I wanted to be fair to him, and I wanted to be fair to the people to whom he caused pain. My agent never mentioned his word without adding an epithet. So that was a very tricky balancing act.
Well, and Mariah, that complicated story about him was not the story I was told growing up, right? I mean, he was a hero. He first Atlantic flight. I mean, and Anne Lindbergh, his wife, who was an amazing writer and did this and did that. And then, I think that this is the wonderful thing about books like yours is that let's talk about how complicated this human being was. We can't deify somebody who's a white nationalist. I mean, it just doesn't,
right.
doesn't
And
work.
yet settling on the villain narrative wasn't entirely it. I would go back and forth.
Yes.
And then I would say, I can't say that there's nothing admirable about this
That's
man.
right. That's right.
And the balance was. Yeah.
And as you said, he was the father of a murdered baby. I mean, I can't imagine going through that and I can't imagine it. I can't imagine it. So let's talk about, the other standalones. So now you're writing standalones. And well, first of all, do you miss writing series? Do you ever look at one of these books and say, oh, I wish I could write another one with these? I love these characters. Or do you just completely encapsulate that world and you're like, I'm done?
I miss Jane Prescott a lot. I had so many stories ready to tell, and so that world and those people I do miss hanging out with. Betty and Charles Lindbergh, I was not sorry to put that story. I feel like I brought her to as happy an ending as she could get to, and that was okay. With Wharton Plot, I was all set to keep going with Wharton. I love her. I love her friends. I mean, Henry James, what's not to love?
Yeah. No.
Elsie DeWolf. She knew so many fascinating people. She was a fascinating person. But Minotaur was very kind in letting me write something about a woman who's on the verge of 50. And I think they're like, and that's good, and that worked, and let's not do that again. That's not what they said to me, but I think they don't want to do a series.
And so now you've got a new book, as we're recording this, coming out in a couple of weeks, but when people listen to it, it'll have been out for a couple of weeks. Tell me about that world. I mean, that's 1920, is that right?
1920. So when we did Lindbergh Nanny, we thought, okay, the true crime thing angle seems to work well. And I'm always interested in what the narrative that gets created around a true crime is. So it made sense to have a writer as a sleuth. So when we were talking about the murder of David Graham Phillips, who was a novelist who was shot outside the Princeton Club in 1911, we went with Edith Wharton for various reasons. So we were thinking, can we do that again? And I proposed an idea that I thought, oh my God, they're never going to go for this because nobody knows either of these people. It was Joseph Elwell, who was a gambler in Lothario, who was found in his West 70th Street townhouse, shot through the head. All the doors and windows were locked. Actually, the inspiration for S.S. Van Dyne's first novel. And the way I found out about the Elwell case was through an article of Morris Markey, who used to write for The New Yorker, wrote for it for many years. And in 1950, he wrote a piece about that old jazz age killing that they never quite solved, about the guy shot through the head. And that year, he was found in his home, shot through the head. And they have never solved that either. So I proposed this, and they said, oh, we like the structure, we like the setup. Nobody's heard of Morris Markey. Can we find a more famous author? And I said, well, the Elwell case might have been one of the cases that inspired The Great Gatsby to some degree. You know, this very wealthy, mysterious man that everybody talks about, but nobody really knows, found murdered in his home. Maybe he was playing around with somebody's wife. And they said, oh, that's good, Zelda. And I said, you know, Zelda was very busy being Zelda at the time. I don't know about Zelda as a detective. But then I realized, looking into her, she and Markey were both from the South. They had both just arrived in New York. They were each ambitious in their own way. And of course, she died in a locked room when the institution she was staying at caught on fire. And she and 8 other women had been locked in their rooms, and they all perished. So that sort of gave me this or perspective of the locked room as celebrity, the locked room as addiction, the locked room as mental illness, the things that, you know, the places you go willingly and die. So she really did. I was like, oh, she really does belong in this book. She should be in this book.
Yeah. And she's a fascinating. Again, people may not know who she was now, but she was something.
I was actually very intimidated by Zelda in a way I was not intimidated by Edith, because Edith, as a New Yorker in her middle age who loves dogs, who leads with words, that felt accessible to me. I was like, how am I going to do a 20-year-old from Alabama who is gorgeous and convinced she is the most fascinating person when she walks in a room, because she is the most fascinating, that level of confidence. And I was very worried about turning her into sort of a manic pixie chaos agent. And I really wanted to delve into what is her arc with this story. Where does she begin? Where does she end? So it was a different kind of challenge that, you know, you're depicting somebody who was very theatrical. I mean, people say like, oh, she was so unself-conscious. And at one point she said, it's a lot of work being Zelda Fitzgerald. So she knew. She was working at it. And she did it really well. And people have responded well to the portrait of Zelda Fitzgerald. And I can't help feeling like that's Zelda. I'll take some credit, but a lot of it is just that woman's charisma and charm just reaches beyond the grave and won't be denied.
Well, but what a lovely thing to round her out, because so often we just think of the mad muse of Scott Fitzgerald, and we don't realize she was a complicated but a complete human being. I mean, there was more to her than that.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And it's tough when she's 20 because she doesn't quite know. She
Yeah.
doesn't quite know everything. Who does when they're 20?
Right. Right. Right.
So
Or what's ahead for both of them. I mean, so do you, I love that this conversation about the writing the series and writing different standalones. I also really appreciate your honesty about, about the fact that when a series is canceled, it's really hard on the author who, unless it's their decision, because there are stories to tell. And who knows, maybe at some point, but you also want to make a living, and you can't make a living without a publisher behind you. Well, can go indie, but as you're navigating a career, that may not be the most fortuitous choice.
I think to have what the people I've seen make that a success have a lot of stamina and drive and organization around the promotion aspect. And I really respect their game, and I see how much work that is. And if I can avoid doing that work, I will, for as long as I can.
Yeah.
So,
It is work. But it sounds to me, or what I'm hearing you say, is that you have an idea, a story, something, from that time that becomes a gravitational pull for you, around which you build the world and the characters and your own story. Am I being accurate in that?
yeah, I think that I was trying to think, why do I pick the cases and the stories that I picked? I mean, New York as a starting point, aside from Lindbergh, is if I can make it happen in New York, I will, just because it's usually a voice in a world that I understand, having grown up here, and I know, I just have a better feel for it than I might say in Alabama or Boston or somewhere like that. California, certainly, that's a whole headspace that, not everyone can do it. But I think it's also crimes that if they hit the tabloids, it's because they were resonant. They felt like they were revealing something about their time, and that's why they hit a nerve. And the Elwell case hit a real nerve, partly because they like to talk about the sex involved with the case. And so I look sort of for the metaphor of what the crime is and build the story out from that. If that makes any sense.
It does make a lot of sense. Of course, now I'm making myself a note to read more about the Elwell case, which I would assume at some point I've heard of, but maybe not. And, you got to love that.
There's a big book coming out next year that's a nonfiction book about it. I was like, couldn't you have done it this year? But yes. So, like locked room, the metaphor of a locked room, or with Lindbergh, I was fascinated by the image of this young woman approaching a house, wanting to get a job, wanting to get inside that house. And how much do we lie about ourselves when we're trying to gain access to a space? How much do we trust people when we let them inside our space? And then what does it mean to the burden of losing someone that you were entrusted with their care? So, and the metaphor of who we let in and who we lose. I mean, it went with Lindbergh's America First, xenophobia, then, his genetic obsession with purity. So, it starts working its way. Betty made some decisions about people she let in her life that she really shouldn't have let in her life. So, it's a neat way to look at history by finding sort of all the picking that prime metaphor and then working it through everybody's narratives.
So interesting. Can you ever relax when you're reading something and not be looking for the next idea for the next novel? I mean, or are you, what else? Are the tens, the teens, the tens and the 20s and the 30s? And is there an era of New York that you're sort of, would love to do more? Or are you happy staying in there? Talk to me about the process of what's next.
Well, currently, and due on October 1st, is the next novel, which is set against the Macy's Day Parade. Someone's trying to kill Santa Claus in 1932. And as I said, like the 30s were such a drab, awful, miserable time. There was something about the joy of that parade, which I used to go to as a kid. And I wanted to do something a little lighter. So I chose that. And it's something with, a million fabulous details to work through the book. So that's a lot of fun. I have eras that I'm really interested in, but we'll see if the true crime, real writer thing continues to work. It may not. In which case I'll have to change it up. I'd love to do something in the 50s. I'd love to do something with E.B. White. He has all these very melancholy, fearful thoughts about, nuclear war and the destruction of the world. That seems like a really interesting head to be in. So it's funny, I don't read a lot of contemporary fiction. I'm either reading friends' books, or I'm reading history, sifting through, saying, "Ooh, can we do this? Can we do that?" So I feel very ignorant when people are like, "Oh, have you read, Lessons in Chemistry?" I was like, I have not read Lessons in Chemistry, but I do have a good reason.
Seems to me that curiosity is a driver for you as well of, just what if, and okay, tell me the other angle and what happened here, and all of that history major training probably also encourages of don't facts are facts, but truth is somebody's interpretation of those facts. I mean, it's always worth revisiting periods of history.
Right. I mean, the wonderful thing about historical novels growing up on them is you realize there are 20 different ways to tell this story. How many versions of Henry VIII have we had? Anne Boleyn has gone from mega conniving slut to, noble mother of Elizabeth I, victim and brilliant woman. And so that is a wonderful thing about history is you can constantly retell those stories.
Now, when you talk to people about writing, what's the best piece of advice you would give somebody?
I would say I do say don't do it unless you truly enjoy. I mean, I know that there are successful writers who say they don't enjoy the writing process. I do. I guess my chief piece of advice is if you can, do it every day. And you don't have to do a lot. You can do I literally do 2 pages a day when I'm starting a book, and that is it. That is all my nerves will take. And then I'm done. So that's a great way to beat off writer's anxiety.
Yeah.
I subscribe to the idea, don't necessarily write what you know, write what you're fascinated by, that you're passionate about, because I think that fascination and enthusiasm will convey itself to the reader. I would say be ambitious in the stories that you tell. It's a very hard market with 4 million volumes coming out every year. Try and move beyond what everybody is doing, and develop. I think writers groups are great. I just started working with one for the first time in my career with the Zelda book, actually. And it's a good group. But I'm glad I didn't do one before that, because I think I had to develop a really good ear for my own work when it's really working, and then when it's just lazy and I'm not, like, the scene is fine, and that's all it is. And it needs to be a lot more, or it's just total garbage. That's what rewrites are for.
Right. And what's the worst piece of writing advice you ever got?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think the writing, when we grew up, you were supposed to write about yourself. It was supposed to be, write what you know, and the book was only as successful as it was a true portrait, a shocking portrait of you. I remember taking a historical book to an editor, and she gave me a real piece of advice in terms of the market at that time, but she said, "This book tells me nothing about who you are." And I was like, well, I don't think that's actually true, but no, it's not my story. But that, I think, is a really limiting. I think that's why we saw so many people write 1 or 2 novels, and then it's like, well, that's it. That's what I got. They couldn't move on from that. So I think, and it's not necessarily a joyous place to be, your own personal history, for a lot of the people. So I think that's a piece of advice I take with a grain of salt, which is not, by the way, to say I do have a lot of respect for the argument of own voices. It's not like, oh, you just go out and you just take anybody's story.
Right.
But the idea that you have to be limited specifically to your own history, and that's the only personal history, that's the only topic worth doing, that I take issue with.
Do you plot, or do you have signposts that you work towards, especially since you're working with, fictionalized historical true crime? There are some things that happen, but tell me about your writing process. Do do you write plot by scenes, or do you just sort of have the outline, or do you, how do you write, Mariah?
I have bad outlines. I like to think I have outlines. Usually where I start is writing about 5 to 20 pages of scenes just to get the voice really going and well oiled. And I'm gangbusters at that first 50 pages. I'm gangbusters at the last 50 pages. And it's just those intervening, 200 pages in between. And I'll write chapter by chapter what I think could happen or should happen. And then when I get to that chapter, when I'm actually writing, I'm like, oh, I thought this was 20 pages. And in fact, this action is a paragraph. And the action that I built in was like, so-and-so goes to talk to somebody. So-and-so then goes to talk to this person. And like, there's no cinematic value in any of those scenes. So that's when you have to go back to the drawing board. And so actually I end up like rewriting the outline sort of halfway through the book, when I guess I feel confident enough to push myself at that point.
And do you ever find that, since you're basing on a story or, something that happened in history, do you feel constrained by that? Do you wish that, something could be different in real, you would have, if I would have written a story or,
I've written 3 of these now, and I've taken 3 different approaches to how close do you stick to the reality. And Lindbergh, very closely. With Wharton, in the crime in question, the person shot themselves directly after shooting David Graham Phillips. It's like, well, that can't happen if it's going to be a mystery. So I was like, let's just change that. And then originally, the person only appeared very briefly in a scene because that would be accurate to what happened. But my editor and I agreed, like, that's not playing fair with the reader. They've got to have a shot at figuring out who it was.
Mm-hmm.
So I moved them more front and center. And then with Zelda, or the Elwell case, I should say, I reworked a few minor details, but I kept to the tabloid accounts of the murder. Now, I'm sure that is not entirely accurate, but there's a basis for everything I put in that book. And it's sort of a question of, why are people coming to this book? With Lindbergh, they're coming for the crime. With Wharton, they're coming for Wharton. So everything I put in Wharton about her was true and accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Everything I put about Zelda, except for the fact she's obviously not a crime fighter and she never actually knew Morris Markey, was accurate. I didn't make up anything about her.
Mm-hmm.
So about the things that matter, I try and be stringently honest and accurate.
I would imagine writing about, Zelda Fitzgerald and knowing how it all ended. There must be a part of you, or there would be a part of me that wishes I could rewrite her ending, right? Rewrite like, or lay off the booze, Zelda.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe date Scott. Maybe you don't need to. Well, you should marry him, but then leave him.
Yeah.
She tried to do, like, 4 years in. What makes you so sad about Zelda is that, she has this zenith when she's, 20, 22.
Mm-hmm.
And she's so on, and she's so fabulous, and she's so this, and you're like, okay, where is the real woman in here? Like, she's fascinating. And it's not until, I would say, a decade later, when she has suffered and she and Scott are trying to work out what the hell happened, I felt like I started hearing her real voice. Like, there is a real adult voice trying to hold him to account, trying to work out her own issues. And it's so sad that she didn't get to be that person longer. Yeah. I would also tell her, make more friends. It's shocking. Like, she put so much energy into Scott. They were constantly moving hither and yon. And then, of course, she was ill and institutionalized. And whereas Edith, getting back to our point about community, has so many rich, strong friendships, Zelda feels so alone. It's really that was the most painful thing to me about her.
Yeah. Well, this is fascinating. And again, just fascinating. And, best of luck with the new book. And yeah, that's exciting.
Thank you for letting me blather on. I love talking about writing. And it's not something everybody wants to hear about at length.
Well, I love doing this podcast and having conversations with people because no two are alike. And it's just, but what does come through is the passion. Because if you don't have passion to talk about this story, the Elwell case, this is a year out of your life of writing it. You couldn't do it, I mean, this is being a writer is being passionate about uncertain things.
Yes. And you have no idea how it will do out there in the world. That's why I say, if you don't love it. Do not do it for the money. Don't do it because you're getting on Johnny Carson, because those days are over. And, movies, good luck. So you better enjoy it and enjoy the community.
Yeah. Excellent advice. Thank you, Mariah.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you for being with us today. Sisters in Crime is about community. We were founded to advocate for women crime writers, and we continue that mission by fighting for equity in the crime writing community. Sisters in Crime is an international, inclusive organization for all who write and love crime fiction, mystery, thrillers, and suspense. Join us at sistersincrime.org and make sure you subscribe to this podcast.